Hello, everybody. Hello. It's nice to see you all here today. Welcome into Conversations with Authors. Today, we bring to you Robert Samuels and Toluse Olorunnipa, the authors of His Name is George Floyd. But before we get to our authors properly, please allow me to welcome you back to Book Passage's Conversations with Authors. If you've seen one of these events before, well, then we're very happy to see you back. And if you're new here, Book Passage is a group of independently run bookstores out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we host and run book talks just like these very often throughout the week. As we are streaming them on YouTube, and will continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. It's completely free to you and honestly helps us out a lot. And as an added bonus, if you click the little bell next to the subscribe button, you'll be alerted every time we go live with talks just like these, so you don't have to miss out on something you otherwise might have really enjoyed. If you'd like to check out our upcoming events, to remind you, we have a number of them in person as well, if you happen to be in the San Francisco Bay Area, or you like the idea of receiving our email newsletter, you can find both of those at bookpassage.com. If you'd like to check out our speaker's book tonight, or anything else that is mentioned here, you can find it using the very first link in the description below, or again at bookpassage.com. Lastly, if you have any questions for us tonight, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat. It's your only way to get your questions to our speakers today, so please do not miss out on your chance. Now allow me to introduce to you our authors. Robert Samuels is a national policy enterprise reporter for the Washington Post who focuses on the intersection of politics, policy, and people. He previously wrote stories about life in the district for the Post's social issues team. Samuels joined the Post in 2011 after spending nearly 5 years working at the Miami Herald. Toluse Olorunnipa is a political enterprise and investigations reporter for the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 2019 and previously covered the White House. Before that, he spent 5 years at Bloomberg, where he reported on politics and policy, but I guess not people, for Washington and Florida. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to all of us today for coming in. And allow me to introduce to you our moderator today. Host, Paula Farmer, who has been with Book Passage for a very long time and hosts and runs panels just like these very often throughout the months. I'm always happy to be the producer behind them, and now I get to introduce her for it. So please, Paula and Tolu and Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick. And can you hear us? Oh, okay. Hi, and I guess I need to adjust so that I can see everybody. There we go. Hello, thank you two for doing this. After reading the book, I just am so honored to step up from host to moderator, and I have lots of questions for you. But as Nick said, we will get to audience questions towards the end. But I want to start off with just a little bit of background information on both of you as it relates to coming into this project. Were you both covering George Floyd's murder and the aftermath for the Post at the time? And if so, were you following the same or maybe a different aspect of it? Either way, and I'm posing that to both of you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. We're really excited about this conversation. The origin story of this book is actually really interesting. We started off with this big team at the Washington Post. I was a White House reporter at the time, covering former President Donald Trump and how he was running the country, how he was running the White House after George Floyd was murdered. Obviously, there was a lot happening at the White House. There was a lot of attention to what President Trump was saying and doing and what kinds of policy issues might come out of this heinous death that everyone watched. There was obviously protest activity in front of the White House, and we all saw how Trump responded to that. So that was how I was covering the aftermath of Floyd's death. But we put together a team at the Washington Post, and we took off reporters from a number of different teams to write this series called George Floyd's America, which was the origin of this book project. It was a 6-part series looking at Floyd's life. And we brought reporters that had covered education, reporters that had covered housing, reporters that had covered healthcare, that had covered a number of different institutions. And we wanted to show how all of those institutions essentially conspired against George Floyd from the time he was born to make it hard for him to live life and to achieve his dreams in America because of the systemic racism and institutional barriers that he faced. So that's really how this project came together. Robert and I came at it from different places. We both cover politics and policy, but at the time I was covering the White House, covering what was happening in the Trump White House and how it was responding to what was happening on the streets.
Right. I think about politics with a very broad definition. People at the Post often joke that I'm the politics reporter that none of the politicians know. And I'll be honest with you, Paula, that when the incident first happened, I didn't have much of a desire to get to Minneapolis. And that's because I had covered Ferguson, I had been in shootings at Dallas, I had covered the tragedy in Newtown, and it's hard. And when I saw the video of Omar Jimenez from CNN being escorted off by police in Minneapolis, it reminded me of a situation at a Trump rally that I did not want to relive. And so when we thought about thinking about policymaking and what was going on in the country and connecting the two, I actually spent time in Tulsa, Oklahoma with a group of white women who were trying to make sense of the country and make sense of the world because it had seemed to have shifted when George Floyd died. And during the course of speaking to them, I really started to understand something that would become the backbone of the theory of what we were trying to do, first with the George Floyd America series, and then in a more deepened form in the book, which was being able to show the connection between the theory of what systemic racism is and the practical impacts of it. When we had a Zoom call and we had a discussion about how the Post should think about covering systemic racism. And it was brought up, I believe, by Tolu, that it would be a great idea to try to look at one person who might have touched all these different institutions. And editor said, I think that's a great idea. And I keep on wondering if the right person is George Floyd. And I just thought that was a really tremendous idea, because not only would it allow us to learn about the soul of the man, it would allow us to connect the soul with the larger human spirit.
So, I mean, this is getting a little meta here, and it's not important. I have so many other areas to go. But how did you, because you said, Tolu, that there were several of you working different angles. How did it come down to the two of you? And did you two know each other personally or professionally or both? And just decide, hey, we've got different angles that would kind of complement each other. Let's go for it.
Yeah,
and it's a huge undertaking. I mean, it's very different writing articles, correct me if I'm wrong, versus taking on the responsibility of a project like this that involves research and things like that. So I'm just curious how the two of you specifically came together on it. And was the fact of going from articles to this kind of daunting for you? Or was it a natural, we've collected all this information, let's just kind of put it together in a book form?
Yeah, I'll jump in here and I'll use the opportunity to offer some praise to Robert, who was really one of the major key reporters on that series. He interviewed more people for that series than just about anyone else who was involved. And Robert and I go way back, actually. We both had an early part of our careers at the Miami Herald more than a decade ago, where we worked together quite a bit. And Robert was actually responsible in some ways for me coming to the Washington Post, because he spent several years trying to recruit me and get people to hire me at the Post, and was very dogged about it. So we had a sense of rapport, and we had known each other for quite a long time, but we actually had not spent a lot of time reporting together. I had been covering the White House. It's a very different kind of reporting gig. It's very, high metabolism, and you're always rushing, and you don't really get to take the time to do the kinds of in-depth reporting that Robert gets to do. So I don't think we had ever worked together on a piece. I was always a fan of Robert's writing because it was always thought-provoking and interesting and well-written. And like he said, he talked to people in the country about how policy impacted them. I was, often following, either former President Obama, former President Trump, writing about the latest thing that had happened at the moment. But when I got to be a part of this team and write for this series, I was one of the lead writers on the first article that kind of put forward the thesis statement for the project and took bits and pieces of the other pieces that were going to be coming along, and also delved into George Floyd's family history. So, when the idea came to put this book together, it was a natural undertaking for Robert and I, both Robert, who had interviewed so many people, had been a part of interviewing the Floyd family, had spent time with the Floyd family, and myself, who had spent some time researching George Floyd's family history and also giving that overview of the overall project and having a sense of what all the other reporters were doing. It made sense for us to come together, and it really was very seamless that we were able to turn what is, like you said, a very different approach of writing articles into turning a project into a narrative nonfiction. We did hundreds of additional interviews. We spent a lot of time embedding with people who could tell us more about George Floyd and his soul and his essence, and really bring him to life on the page, through his adolescence, through his adulthood, through his final moments. And being able to take the time to do that kind of reporting, that kind of writing, I think allowed us to present his story in an even more powerful way.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Rob.
Oh no, I just Tolu's very kind. I just want to note that one of the reasons that I thought it would be great to work with Tolu is he's an incredibly fast and comprehensive writer himself. And we were told that we needed to do this book rather quickly. And the reason we needed to do it rather quickly was because the need to be able to continue this conversation in the United States was becoming greater as the idea and the movement itself and the conversations about systemic racism were starting to shift. And so that was a part of it. I will push back a little bit, moving from, I write long stories, but there was this idea that we knew when we did the original series that there was just a lot more work to be done. And not only that, we also knew that we could talk about the impact that George Floyd had after he died, which we were not able to do. And so, I mean, when we started the series, when we started reporting on the book, we had no idea whether Derek Chauvin was going to be convicted. We had no idea whether the Policing Act was going to be passed. And it allowed us to think really deeply, but be with people who are thinking in real time about some of these issues, which helped enrich the reporting. So it wasn't daunting at first. It was pretty exciting.
Well, and I'm glad though that it wasn't like such a quick turnaround, like maybe for the year anniversary, because you gave a chance for there to be a little bit of space and a little breathing room, and we're all at kind of a different space right now. Like even with his murder was so, for so many reasons, was so important, and such a capsule of what happened, what was going on at the time. We were at the beginning of the pandemic, not the middle of it. We were at the beginning of it, and so much was happening from a public health standpoint as well as politically. You guys had a chance to see us change administrations, and so I think I'm glad it wasn't too fast a turnaround, but it was like, this is perfect because we're coming up to the second anniversary. And I want to move into, we all know that George Floyd kind of symbolized or continues to symbolize police brutality, as well as racism within the ranks of the police department. But you show, and that is important, and we certainly need to talk about that and continue to talk about that. But you also show he represents other social injustices. Like, and I'm sure you got that as you were examining his life. And can both or one of you explain that, how it's not just the police brutality, it's not just what happened on that day. There was so much in his life that kind of exemplifies what's wrong in our society.
Yeah, the battle for George Floyd to breathe in America as a Black man started long before he met Derek Chauvin. And it started long before George Floyd was alive. When we start looking at his ancestry, Tolu, he went through the history of George Floyd's family and discovered that, you know, if he was a white man in America, he would have been an heir likely to a wealthy fortune. His great-grandfather, Hillary Thomas Stewart, owned 500 acres of land. He was one of the most prosperous landowners in North Carolina. And all of that was taken away from him through fraudulent tax schemes, taking advantage of the fact that he could not read because the government did not allow him to read. And that set, before he could make one transfer of intergenerational wealth, all of it was whittled away. And that sets the Floyd family for generations on a journey inside poverty, but also it tells them something about how to live and succeed in America, which was do your job, keep your head down, and be afraid, because a white man might take advantage of you at any given point, so you can't mess up. Think about what kind of message that does to a family to know that over generations. Think about how that shapes its ambition. That's where the story starts. And then you start thinking about what happens when George Floyd comes to this place, when he's living in a crumbling housing project that's segregated because the federal government designed it to be so, because it was a redlined community, to a school system that was under-resourced and crumbling because it did not have the support, and said, the best way for a person who looks like you, George Floyd, who is tall and fast, is to become good in football. It's to be a basketball player, get a scholarship like some of the other people, go pro. That's what you're going to do. And that, of course, means that's what you invest in and not your education until you get to college and you can't meet the academic requirements because your high school didn't train you to do so. So not only do we see the foundational issues that start at the roots of racist policies in the United States, we also see how they pile up over the course of the years. And that means he starts to respond to a system that does not treat him fairly. So that's what we start to go through in the book. And we note throughout how George Floyd, despite all of these things, never fully gave up. He still believed that something was possible.
Yeah, I found that amazing. That and what I loved about the book is, one, you put it in context, not only about his life, but you put it in context of society and what's going on in America at that time or in his community, which I think is brilliant, because we get kind of the broader picture and then we get the personal picture of him. But his humanity, his personality, I found was so interesting, especially since we didn't get, immediately we got so caught up in the rage of what happened to him, and then the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and all the aftermath. But he was actually despite all the negativity in his life growing up, he was amazingly positive most of the time, and had a very gregarious personality. I say this because I've read the book and not because I know him. You guys probably feel like you know him after all this. But Tolu, what did you find? Was there anything surprising you found about him personally as you were doing this research? And also about what was going on in the background in society. He was born in '73 in the midst of Jim Crow, in the Jim Crow South. And then in the '80s, as he's a boy and going into, teenage years, there's that whole Reagan era. So anyway, that's pretty packed, but take it away.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought that up and that you engaged in the book at such a deep level, because there's so much I want to talk about. The first couple of words in the introduction are "I love you." And we write that Floyd used that terminology so often to people he knew, to strangers, to the celebrities that he ran into, to the homeless people on the street, to women in his life, platonic relationships and lovers. He just said, "I love you" so often. He would text it to people in all caps. In some of the videos that we've seen of him, he says, "I love you, man. God loves you. Just put the guns down, relax. No need for all this violence." He was always saying, "I love you," and trying to spread love in the world. He did have a positive spirit. He did have a spirit of a striver, because he faced a number of challenges, as Robert laid out. In his upbringing, he lived in a incredibly poor neighborhood and crowded housing conditions. But he was always someone to walk into a room, no matter how poor or impoverished it looked, and look everyone in the eye and shake them by their hand and say, introduce himself. And he wanted to put people at ease, because he knew he was the biggest person likely to be in that room. And that some people would be intimidated by him. And if you see this big guy who's this big athlete who, works out and takes care of his body, you might be intimidated and think, this is a scary person. Floyd did not want to own that kind of stereotype. He wanted people to think and know him for who he was, which was somebody that had his mother's heart. He was a mama's boy growing up, and he had his mother's generous and kind-hearted spirit. And he was always someone who people said was a gentle giant, would give you the shirt off his back. And in some ways, he may have been too accommodating and too willing to please, because after he left college without a degree and without an income, one of the things he wanted to do was provide, and that led him into the teeth of the Reagan era war on drugs, which had started around the time of his birth, and the mass incarceration system that was expanding rapidly. We documented in the book how quickly, especially in Texas, this punitive carceral system was expanding. New prisons were being built on a monthly basis, and they were being filled with young, poor minority men like Floyd, often on nonviolent drug crimes. And the majority of the criminal activity on his record involves nonviolent drug crimes for petty drug deals. We cite research in the book about how, and this is well-known research for a lot of your viewers, drug use among Blacks and whites and people of different backgrounds are about even when it comes to what people self-report and what social science shows. But when it comes to who gets locked up, who gets targeted, who has police circling their neighborhood looking to arrest people, it's in neighborhoods like Floyd's, and he was a victim of that. He was targeted often. And we document that he was stopped by police more than 20 times in his life, and at least 6 of those police were later charged with misconduct, and some of them charged with falsifying arrest records and falsely accusing people specifically because they wanted to keep arrest records up, and they were targeting communities like Floyd's because they knew that was an easy place to make arrests, and that people would not have lawyers, would not have the funds to fight the charges, and would take plea deals. And Floyd took several plea deals. He actually never faced a jury of his peers, despite having a long criminal rap sheet. He never went to trial. He always took a plea deal. He never had a lawyer that he could pay for. So this system and the systems that he faced, especially the criminal justice system, were so ruthless that it made it difficult for him to escape. And despite him having a personality that in another world may have allowed him to be something even more significant in his life, he was shut down as he tried to chase a number of different dreams.
Yeah, because at one point you even mentioned, as far as never having good legal representation, he actually had a rapport with his bail bondsman. I can't think of the guy's name. It's
Travis Keynes.
yes, and Travis would actually give him advice. Probably not the best person to give advice, but probably knows more than like I would or somebody. And I remember there's this one section where he got picked up for something, and once again it was kind of like either mistaken identity or he just was kind of caught up in some kind of raid. But Travis tells him, "Oh, you need to just eat it. I know it's going to be criminal." It was like his first criminal or felony charge or something. He was like, "You need to just do it, suck it up." And he was in there for like 2 or 4 months or so. The longest time at that point that he had been in jail, and it was very frightening for him. But that's just ridiculous. Like you mentioned, the police were targeting his neighborhoods and arrest records and things like that. So that's really a thing. Like I really want to kind of hit on that from one or both of you. That just,
yeah.
Talk about that. That's ridiculous.
Well, I think one of the lingering questions about George Floyd, right? And I'm sure there are people who are listening who might have this question is, didn't he rob a pregnant woman at gunpoint? This is a theory that's on the internet. And people suspect that if we talk about a person who is a human person who is gregarious and godly, that there could not be a discussion of this, but there is. And we talked to the person we talked to the victim, the person who was robbed that day. And one of the things that we found out is that when she was presented the photos in a lineup, in a way, and the way it was presented using an officer who was there at the time, would not be permissible today in Texas. It's seen as a dubious practice. She has a choice on who she identifies. She says, you can say, you're certain, you can say you're uncertain, you can say you're tentative. She chose tentative. She also wasn't pregnant at the time, but that's another story. And that doesn't meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard as we know it, right? So why did George Floyd take this deal? Well, he's living in a community where you are told that if you do not do everything perfectly as a Black man, those are your first 2 strikes in America, you will end up dead or in prison. And so there was a feeling that your time would be coming. And it might not be fair, but no one is going to believe you in a jury in Texas. So if you're faced with 40 years or 5 years, you take the 5 years. And I think that shows some of the cruelty and the absence of trust in what is supposed to be the ultimate system of trust in the United States, right? That the court system is fair and will treat you fairly. There was no presumption that judicial system would treat George Floyd fairly. So he took the easiest path, which was to take the 5 years.
It's so hard to hear. I mean, we know it, but to actually hear it. And once again, he's symbolizing so many things that are so important for us to really look at in our justice or injustice system. So you mentioned he was basically a mediocre student through no fault of his own, a talented athlete. Do you think, but he got his hopes dashed where college was concerned and furthering his education, whether through sports or academically. And do you feel like it was because of that he kind of got caught up in drugs, like the depression behind that, the disappointment behind that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about his education because that was a big part. We have an entire chapter that looks at his educational experience, and we start his educational experience by interviewing his second grade teacher, when Floyd was in second grade, he attended a segregated all-Black school in Third Ward that happened to be one of the poorest schools in one of the poorest districts. But he was reading and doing math and writing on grade level. I saw the records from this teacher who actually kept the records for 40 years. And, she had everything written down in her yellow notebook, and she had all of the national test scores that George Floyd, known as Perry at the time to his classmates, was on grade level with every other student across America on national benchmarks. That was an achievement in a school like the school that he went to that was under-resourced. And there was an essay that he wrote when he was in second grade. An essay, it might be a little charitable, but for second graders, it was, what they would call an essay, but it was a assignment that his teacher had given him and the other students to talk about what they wanted to be, how they wanted to be a future famous American, how they would be prominent in the future. And he wrote that he wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. At the time, Thurgood Marshall was the first Black Supreme Court justice in America, and he had learned about him, and he said he wanted to follow in his footsteps. So there was a time in Floyd's life where he was doing his academic work, he was meeting his benchmarks, and he had big dreams for how to turn an education into a real career. Now, over the course of the next several years, he goes to more underfunded public schools. And as Robert says, there's no pathway. It seemed like there's no pathway from that to what his dreams were. The pathway out of the projects that he could see that, anyone who had made it out had done so essentially through sports. And he had this big body, he had this athletic gift that he was talented with, and he was steered away from the idea that he might be able to make it out through academics. His schools were underfunded. And he focused on sports. But as Robert said earlier, he was not able to see the field in college because his academics were so shaky that he was not eligible. And he left college knowing that his family relied on him, knowing that he needed to provide, and really broken. He saw his way out. He saw a glimpse of light. Getting a college scholarship from the Third Ward is, a sign that you might have a potential to go pro. It's a sign that things may be going well for you. But that door closed quickly on him, and he had to find a way to survive as someone who did not have a college degree, did not have an income, did not have a sports contract, and had very little prospects for how to actually make ends meet. And yes, that did lead him into what was the leading economic trade in his neighborhood at the time, the drug trade, unfortunately, and it led him to getting caught up in the mass incarceration that was taking place in the country and being arrested several times for, petty drug possession, petty drug deals, $10 here, $20 here. A $10 deal gets you 10 months behind bars because you don't have a lawyer, you don't have the ability to fight back or know what to say. When you're interrogated, you take the plea deal because you know that the state is going to throw you behind bars and lock away the key if you try to go to trial. And he had that experience, and that really did break him and make it harder for him to find redemption later in life.
But he left Texas. He went from Florida to Texas, but then Texas to Minneapolis. And I think, wasn't that a turning point for him? Like he became very aware of the direction his life was going. Once again, through no fault of his own, but he probably didn't realize it was not his fault, but he wanted to turn things around. And he ends up leaving Texas and going to Minneapolis. Can you tell us a little bit about that period in his life? And then we can start to bring it up to, that horrible day.
Sure. George Floyd, I think it's important before we get there. He had always believed that he was not going to be a person on the corner. That was the thing he did not want. He wanted to touch the world. That's what he would say to his sister Jaja. That's what he would say to his friends. And so by the time he's in his 40s, he sees a person that he is who he never wanted to be. And he can't figure out how to do it in Texas. He has his criminal record. He has a daughter he wants to provide for. And he can't, because he had this criminal record, you can't get even a professional licenses in Texas. You can't even be a barber at the time in Texas if you had an arrest record. And so there he is on the corner, and he sees a friend who comes out of this rental SUV, and he looks good. He's bigger than he used to be. He looks clean. He tells everyone he's clean, he's working, and he found some redemption in the state of Minnesota. And he starts telling the people, you can do this. You can get some change in your life. And he connects him with a pastor who has made it his mission in the community to take people who are downtrodden and want to see something different and try to find them some way to rehabilitate their lives. It's important to note here that in Texas, there was a big sea change in what people should do, what the state should do to people who are behind bars. There was once a theory that maybe you provide them beds and safe houses so you could rehabilitate them if they had substance use issues. But then that disappeared. And Texas also didn't expand Medicaid. And so there was no way for a person like George Floyd to get insurance. So the pastor concludes that if George Floyd wants to change his life, he should go to rehabilitation in a place that's a little bit more progressive. And that place was Minnesota. And this is not an easy thing to do, right? But one of the things we talk about in the book is something called John Henryism, which is a theory that's based out of social science research that talks about how Black people often feel like they need to do Herculean things to get their lives right because there is no social support. Colloquially, we'll say, you work twice as hard to get half as far, right? And so this is an act of John Henryism. He goes on a Greyhound bus, and we talk about the decisions and sort of the back and forth in the book about why and how he's going to do this. But he decides ultimately that if he's going to be a better man, he needs to get out of his community and try something different. That Minneapolis was going to be his chance to heal.
Yeah, interesting. And so he ends up there, and we know pretty much the situation. I won't have you go through that whole thing, and people should definitely read the book to get kind of the details of what was going on in his life, like the context of that day, and how he ends up in that situation. It's just,
I just want to say here, Paula, I know thinking about the incidents of May 25th it's hard. It's hard because of what we saw. It's what inspired a global movement. It's also true, right, that George Floyd woke up on May 25th not knowing what the world would be like on May 26th. And one of the things that we do in the book is we walk through what he was trying to do, which is, it was illustrative of the rest of his life. He was trying to make choices. He was trying to keep on a good path. He was trying to feel affirmed. And that leads to a larger terror of what can happen when you're Black in America and you meet the wrong police officer. But it's not the full context unless we have the understanding of what happened before, right? Mm-hmm. And what happened before was you had a person who had a strong belief in the American promise and woke up that day still believing in it. And I think that's important for everyone to recognize.
Oh, absolutely. And I have a friend who always says, she said this in the context of going to Brian Stevenson's, the museum he created, the Lynching Museum. And I would say it applies to this too. She says, if they can bear it, we can witness it. And that's why I think your book is so important, because you're giving witness to his life, to social injustice in his life that actually represents many, many other people, but also bearing witness to that day where he was personally on that day. I also appreciate and respect you for having information in there about background information on Chauvin, the officer that murdered him. And I'm wondering which of you had to take that part of it, and what was that like for you?
That was Robert. Robert led that chapter and really exquisitely was able to unfurl some of Chauvin's own history and why it was not surprising that he used the tactics that he used. I'll let Robert jump in and talk a little bit about that.
So Derek Chauvin is an extraordinarily ordinary police officer from what we learned. And I think it's important to know that we thought it was important to include him in the book because racism just it's not simply a story for Black people and other people of color. It consumes and can corrupt the spirit of everybody. And so we tried to speak with somewhere more than 100 people who had known Derek Chauvin over the course of his life. Many of them didn't want to put their names to it. But what we learned was Derek Chauvin was, at some point in his life, really loved watching Starsky and Hutch. He developed this intensity for wanting to become a police officer. We follow a bit of his journey into that after spending some time in the Army and acting as a military police officer. And when he joins the Minneapolis Police Department, which does not have a reputation for being very kind to Black people, which is, they are about 1 in 5 people in Minneapolis is Black. He joins one of the most notoriously violent police districts. That's the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. And over the course of his police career, he amasses complaints, a number of them. And we detail them in the book. But here's where the rubber meets the road here. In 2010, there is an incident in which a man dies after police kneel on his neck. That man's name was David Cornelius Smith. The police department, even though the officers were not indicted, they were cited as following protocol, decide that they need to train people to use what we call neck restraints. That's, putting your arms around someone, stopping their breathing, putting them in a prone position on the floor, or what we call the maximum restraint technique, which is what the officers used on George Floyd that day. Now, the reason they didn't ban it was supposed to be charitable. It was supposed to be something that would preclude the use of fatal force, so they wouldn't shoot anyone. But what ends up happening is you have a district that's known for using overly aggressive tactics and a lack of discipline for police officers when they receive complaints. Derek Chauvin had a number of complaints before he met George Floyd. And he did not there's no record of him getting anything more than a slap on the wrist for any of them. And over the time of his career, those uses of force become more and more aggressive. And we document a number of incidents that happened where his reasoning for using those aggressive techniques are that the person was bigger than him, significantly bigger than him. That's the kind of person who meets George Floyd that day. He's a police officer who's working in a police department in a precinct known for being aggressive, in a department known for not disciplining aggressive officers, who has increasingly used this potentially deadly technique virtually without impunity. And that's what we know about Derek Chauvin. But it's important to know that the systems of policing in America that have disproportionately impacted and consistently used stronger force against people of color were also operating in Derek Chauvin that day. He was given tools, and then he was not monitored to see how he was using those tools.
Gosh, it's like the perfect storm. horribly, the perfect storm, the two of them crossing paths in this horrible, tragic way. Tolu, I'm curious, personally and professionally, were you surprised by the impact of his murder, as horrible as it was? But you both cover so many things, and were you personally or professionally surprised just the massive impact it had and kind of reigniting BLM and the whole world, actually? I mean, it wasn't just in America, it was kind of went worldwide, the reaction. Were you surprised?
I honestly can't say I was surprised. I have covered a number of protests and a number of these heinous killings the way Robert has. And I was in Florida when Trayvon Martin was killed, and I covered the state legislature in the aftermath of the acquittal of his killer. I went to Ferguson after Michael Brown was killed. It was near the White House and around Baltimore. I was covering the White House when Freddie Gray was killed, and Baltimore was engulfed in flames and protests. And I saw sort of the cadence of how these things happen, of how someone dies. There's either a video or a social media campaign or imagery that sparks some kind of a movement or some kind of an emotion in people, and they take to the streets. Police crack down, and there's tear gas, and there's rubber bullets, and there's a conflagration for a number of days, sometimes weeks, and then things kind of move on. The movement does not broaden out beyond the core activists that made up the Black Lives Matter movement that sprouted up after Trayvon Martin died, who should be given their due for being the backbone of what happened. I don't think that the movement would have happened after George Floyd if all of the legwork hadn't been done by the Black Lives Matter activists in other situations. But I was surprised. I think what happened with Floyd was unique in a few ways. Obviously, there was a global pandemic going on in which people could not look away from their televisions. They were stuck at home. There were not concerts or other kinds of distractions that would have taken people to be able to take their minds off of what happened. And this was not one of those debatable uses of force that happened in a split second, where you get 3 seconds on a video and 5 people think it's the right use of force. 5 people think it was excessive, and you debate it, and then you don't get a coalition. What we saw was more than 9 minutes of someone begging for their life. Several of those minutes, he was still on the ground, not moving, not even speaking, and was still being oppressed by the knee of the officer. And he was crying for his mother for a good chunk of the time, and crying out for mercy, crying out for help, and he was being met with brutal force rather than mercy. And I think there's something universal about the way his death played out on video, and the fact that so many people from so many different backgrounds connected with that moment, and they could hear his cries, they could hear his begs for mercy and connect with it on a human level. Even if they never knew anyone who was like George Floyd, never knew anyone from his community, had never even been to the community, people who drive by some of these communities felt George Floyd's pain in that moment. And I think that's why the coalition was built so broad. And you had people from all different backgrounds, different political backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, taking to the streets together in a moment of unity to decry what had happened, to call for justice, to say that this is not right, that this should not be the America, the world that we live in, that there are things that are universal. And I was surprised by that because I had been covering the Trump administration. I had seen how polarized we were as a country, how difficult it is to get people to agree on anything, how easily things broke down into partisan fights. And obviously over the last 2 years, we've seen that happen. But in the immediate aftermath of Floyd's death, there was this unity, there was this united spirit around crying out for justice, saying that something needed to be done. And it was this massive outpouring that we have not seen in a generation. And I think that's what surprised me, because I had become somewhat cynical, and maybe rightfully so in hindsight now, but at the time I did not think that there would be as much of a broad and united outpouring of support for Floyd and for a movement for protecting the life of someone like Floyd and protecting the life of other people who look like Floyd. I was surprised at the time, and I have also been surprised by what has happened since, because I think that's something that shows the way these movements happen. Oftentimes there's a backlash, and we're seeing some of that backlash now.
Yeah, before we do have a couple audience questions. Before we get into that, I want to just kind of ask one more thing. So we're right on the cusp of the 2-year anniversary of his murder. Since then, and maybe at least one example of what I'm about to say was just before, there have been several police seemingly racially motivated shootings, killings like Dante Wright, Breonna Taylor, Andre Hill. And that's not even including things that maybe don't have police related to it, just like what happened with Ahmaud Arbery, just racially motivated murders of Black people. And certainly just a few days ago in Buffalo. So I feel like in some ways you're in the thick of it, covering it. Between what you covered the last 2 years with George Floyd and now these things I've just listed, which are just a few, sad to say. Do you feel that there is a light at the end of the tunnel with this? Do you think we're kind of headed to a path of, I mean, there's never going to be utopia. We know that. But do you see some sort of light, some sort of significant change moving us to a better place?
I'll start. One thing that I think gets lost in the shuffle of this, because we're talking a lot about pain. And Tolu and I were very conscientious of the idea that we did not want to write solely about Black pain because it's not the full story. It can be reductive and exploitative. And that this question was operating within me. What is this about? And it turns out that one of the bright lights was George Floyd himself, learning about George Floyd. And while so many of these things that happened to him could have happened to any American, I think there's something within the message of how he continued to believe that something could change that was ultimately inspiring for me as a writer. And then you see the world, right? You see that there have been differences. 16 states by the 1-year anniversary of his death had banned no-knock warrants and or chokeholds. You saw some of these big cultural debates suddenly get settled, whether Aunt Jemima should be on your pancake syrup, whether the Washington football team should have a racial slur in its name. You have all of that. And then you have the reality that when the world could move on and when race and racism became diluted in the typical moving of our lives, in the typical political system, it got pushed to the back burner again. What we hope this book does is begin to recenter the conversation. I was with Courtney Ross, George Floyd's last girlfriend, and a number of women who had also lost their loved ones to police in dubious practices when I heard Dante Wright died. A number of them knew them. And it became clear to me that race and racism, the system, the residue of that, is not just a lingering cloud or a stain on when we think about America. It's a pernicious force that moves. It moved a man to go and kill some people just shopping for groceries in Buffalo, I apologize. And if we don't acknowledge and confront it, then it can consume and corrupt all of us. And so I think the challenge where we should be is thinking about how we can dismantle such a force before it consumes us all.
And I'll just add really quickly to what Robert just said. The last chapter of the book is titled American Hope. So I want people who haven't read the book or picked it up yet to to know that we realize that there is more to the story than the pain and the dangers and the darkness of racism. There's the other side of the story, that people who have been subjected to that level of racism and hardship continue to show up for this country, continue to love this country, continue to believe in this country. George Floyd was one example, but we have many examples of Black people not giving up on this country and wanting to change it. Some of them are activists and some of them took to the streets, and people from all different backgrounds were not taken, did not come to the conclusion that America is something to be given up on. There's this hope that America can live up to its highest ideals. And even in sort of dark moments after the aftermath of Buffalo and other moments where we see that darkness, there's a sense that we still believe in the promise of this country. We still believe that it's worth fighting for. We hope that people will read this book and think about ways in which we can show more grace to people like George Floyd, so that the country will get closer to its ideals. But there is that hope and there is that light that's available for people if we're all willing to engage with the harder parts of our history and the troubles in our, the current realities that we face. We can change them for the better.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I agree that you put that in the book. Like, you don't come away from it feeling depressed. You feel like, hey, I'm bearing witness to it. I'm dealing with it. I'm reading it. I'm learning it. But there is hope, and it's in the people. It's in the people like George Floyd, who actually had these great dreams and plans that were so noble and selfless. And then, like you said, the activists or just the everyday protesters going out because they were moved. I mean, there's hope just in that alone. But I do want to get to a question or two, or people will be mad at me. So, okay. So here's one quick question before we wrap it up. I see one. You covered the trial. It's part of this to a certain extent. And we can't go too long on this, but just kind of quickly, were you surprised by the results? Were you heartened by it? As journalists and as people that were personally involved in, talking to family members and activists and things like that, were you surprised? What was your personal and professional reaction to the trial?
I was not surprised. I remember two of my good friends, they covered the trial, one for the New York Times and one for the Wall Street Journal. And yeah, when we were talking about when we thought we were going home, I said, we'll be home in 2 days. And it happened in 2 days. I think the world had stated it was wrong. And the video had stated it was wrong, and the defense did not put up a good defense that did not rely on some of the most overt racial tropes that you could think of. And it didn't seem like it would fly. That said, what surprised me as a journalist is what happened after. I was surprised that lawmakers whittled away and squandered the opportunity that they had before them to do something about policing on a federal level.
Yeah. Well, with that, we ended talking about the trial and hope and the humanity of George Floyd. Thank you so much for writing this, for taking the time. I know it couldn't have been easy. But I so appreciate it. And I'm really hoping people will continue to listen to you and read the book. It's so worth it. Do you do the reading on the audio part?
We read the introduction and the author's note, but I will give a plug for the amazing narrator that we got, Dion Graham. He read Colson Whitehead's Harlem Shuffle.
Yes.
And he did such a great job reading and bringing these characters to life, bringing Floyd to life. I can't recommend the audiobook enough. I think it would be an amazing listen for your listeners and for your viewers.
Yeah, and speaking of books, we have plenty of his name is George Floyd at Book Passage, San Francisco, Corte Madera. We love it when you support our events by coming to these events, engaging in the conversation, but also supporting the writers and their works. And we do have first edition copies at both our locations, or we can take your orders over the phone or online. But I think it's one of the best nonfiction books of 2022. I'm just going to say it. It is. I don't care what else comes out. It's very important. It's well written by two of our best journalists out there working for the Post, and really appreciate that you did this, Tula. And gosh, I mean, you guys are amazing. Thank you for doing this. Robert, you did a great job, and thank you for, even though you said at the beginning when you were assigned that you weren't really looking forward to it, I'm glad you overcame it. It seems like it was a pairing that was meant to be, and a project that's so worthwhile. Thank you for doing this, and continued success.
Thank you for having us.
We really appreciate it, and thank you to all the viewers. We really appreciate your time and your willingness to engage with this subject. We're really grateful.
Thank you.